The lagging part of the journey went smoothly. The boatswain had to give the punks his cabin, and they took full advantage of it. Pablo provided Hollow with a scanned map, and together they delved into studying it. Torin methodically emptied the personal supplies of liquor that the bosun had so carefully hidden under the bed. Ripley and Dr. Smitty were discussing Captain Kruger. Bo was showing Kirby the gold and silver products he had surreptitiously stolen from the pockets of gullible sailors. Kirby watched with his mouth hanging open. At last, Hollow finished studying the map, and with his fingers folded into a house, he began. So our customer had a guide who led him to the volcano. Then he passed on and left the guide waiting. He must have visited the place before he got his hands on the crown. I dare say the true place of the crown is in the volcano. Why then would the customer leave the guide alive? Wouldn't it make sense to kill the witness? Ripley asked thoughtfully. You're right, unless he thinks he can't get through, Jackson said, biting his lower lip. What does that mean? Torin hiccuped and smiled in embarrassment. His cheeks glowed a shade of red. So there'll be a trap. Hollow glanced at the map. Yes, come on, a trap. There's not a trap I can't disarm. Bo unwrapped a naked dagger in his hand. I'd like to remind you that the Milky Rogues are our main problem. We've only gotten rid of one competitor, Dr. Smitty said after clearing his throat. Actually, we could use them. It's easier to steal the crown from them than from a mysterious customer, Hollow grinned. Right. Let them go ahead. Disarm the trap. Take the crown and bring it to us on a platter, Pablo smiled. Then kill them, smash their heads, crush them. Kirby began to shout. Phew, Kirby, not so loud. Torin pressed his palms to his ears. I don't like it. Ripley shook her head as she looked over the map. No less than I do, Ripley. No less than I do, Hollow nodded. Soon the ship reached and disembarked. After the events of the theft, many of the traveling companions were glad to be on solid ground sooner rather than later. Naturally, the gang of Milky Rogues were the first to enter the landing bay and set out purposefully to find a means of transportation. The space punks were the last to leave the starship. See you soon, Ripley, the ship's captain waved, smiling. I hope we never see you again, you piece of guano, thought Ripley, but said something quite different. I look forward to it. Taking the girl under his arm, Dr. Smitty took her aside and began to interrogate her about the events in the captain's cabin. Of course, Smitty disapproved of Hollow's methods, but he dare not contradict him either. All of them, the crew, owed their lives to Hollow in some way. He literally saved each of them, gave them shelter, a job, and most importantly, a long-forgotten feeling. Family. Though Hollow very often put family members at risk, he always ended up with a backup plan for a backup plan. The team deftly followed the actions of the Milky Rogues. They got hold of a spacewalker and set off. The space punks followed suit. It is not difficult to drive the spacecraft, but it requires a degree of skill. Bo was one of them. It was getting close to evening when their spacecraft crossed the slope and arrived at the volcano itself. The main thing was not to rush. Don't forget that the signal is when the rogues blow the hidden passageway, Hollow reminded them. What are we going to do? Wait at the door until the rogue gets the crown and then steal it from them? Torin took out his flask and shook it in frustration. There was no booze left. What if it's too late? If there's another way out? Ripley asked. There is, said Kirby. Pablo sighed. I've already thought of that, so we'd better wait a little while and follow the Milky Rogues into the volcano. Maybe we can find the right moment and get rid of them all at once. Hollow's words were followed immediately by an explosion. The tramps were already in action. Bo, drive! Hollow ordered. The albino began to speed up the engine. The spacewalker accelerated, creaking the structure. To get to the indicated place on the map, one had to make a fairly large turn right at the base of the volcano and through a small inner passage that literally bypasses the volcano itself. It was with all this data and the type of terrain in mind that Hollow and Bo had specifically rented a space vehicle that had adjustable suspension. This gave the rover the ability not to tip over when driving on slopes. The rest was up to Bo. Accelerating, Bo made a sharp right turn into the volcano pass. Pablo slammed into the seat next to him and cursed inaudibly. Torin was already stroking his blasters in preparation for a firefight. Strapping on his seatbelt, Pablo began setting up his holographic projector, drone teleporter, and smart grenades. Kirby was cracking his knuckles, and Dr. Smitty was fumbling with syringes of adrenaline and other neurostimulants. Only Hollow sat nonchalantly while continuing to admonish Bo about speed. Ripley watched the road tensely. The spacecraft sped out of the passageway, almost tipping over on its side as it drove towards the disappearing ball of smoke. "Quiet," Hollow asked. Bo slowed and stopped 100 paces away from the Milky Rogues gang's spacewalker. There was no one around. Hollow concluded that the whole gang had passed into a hidden passageway. Of course, that was a stupid decision, since they should have left at least someone to keep an eye on the spacewalker. Space punks cautiously walked around the nuisance wagon and stood by the passageway. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A scruffy, dark tunnel from the explosion, but a primal shriek cut through the silence and darkness of the tunnel. "Looks like a massacre with the customer," Dr. Smitty concluded. "Or the one guarding the customer." Hollow looked up at the volcano itself, as if it had the answer. "I don't know what's next, but let's get in there and chop everyone up." Torin drew his blasters and deftly twirled them in his hands. He hadn't shot anyone in over a day, and it was stressing the man out. "As much as it's unfortunate to agree with you, you're right this time, Torin." Hollow nodded, and the team rushed down the aisle. Breaking away from the group, Bo walked first. He walked silently. He very often walked ahead of the team. It was also his genetics that allowed him to see in the dark, as in dim light. Kirby was next, cannon fodder, and only then the team captain. Torin was at the back. The gunner always stayed behind so he could cover the team in time. "Light?" Hollow whispered. Pablo pulled out a pair of metal balls. Clicking them, he activated the mechanisms. The balls spread their thin metal wings and soared into the air. Hovering over Pablo's head, they emitted a faint glow. The path lit up and the team walked very quickly through a long corridor. Another passageway appeared ahead, with Bo standing in it. The albino turned sharply and put his index finger to his lip. "What?" Kirby started, but Bo deftly slid back and put his palm around the speaker's mouth. With a glance at Kirby, he put his finger to his lips again. Hollow watched Bo's actions, realizing that they must not make a sound. Drawing a question mark in the air, the crew chief looked at Bo. He nodded and beckoned the commander to follow him with a hand. The space punks approached the passageway, and as soon as Pablo's drone illuminated the room, they saw a terrible scene. The entire Milky Rogues crew, or what was left of it, was strewn about. Their bodies had been unceremoniously ripped apart. In the corner lay Greg, whose arm had been torn off. The head of the Milky Rogues was clutching his convulsing wound whilst trembling with fear. The light in the room gave him a glimpse of Hollow. The latter read a plea for help in his opponent's eyes. Bo drew a question mark in the air and then gestured Greg to Hollow. After that, he made a gesture with the fingers of his right hand. "Speak." Greg nodded and pointed to the walls of the room, then gestured to the monster with his hand. Then he drew a question mark in the air, and then he opened his mouth and moved his lips silently as if to speak. Immediately after that, he pointed to the walls, gestured toward the cross, and only then pointed his hand to his companions. Hollow nodded and gestured for Greg to come to him. He shook his head, clearly refusing to move. Hollow nodded to his team and walked in the opposite direction. One by one, the team turned to follow the ringleader, but Torin paused to give Greg the middle finger. After a minute, they went outside. "What was that?" Pablo asked. "If I understood correctly, there's a monster in the walls." Then Greg showed a question mark and moved his lips. Ripley explained thoughtfully. "It means question and answer," Dr. Smitty guessed. "The password?" Bo was surprised. "Damn, and I was getting ready for a gunfight." Torin put his hands on his blasters in frustration. "Do we have any options?" Ripley asked. "Options?" Kirby repeated and slammed his fist into his palm. "This creature, or monster, definitely reacts to movement, so I already have one option." Hollow turned around and walked back down the passage. The space punks looked at each other and followed him. Hollow stood in the aisle and looked at Greg. The head of the Milky Rogues looked menacingly at his opponents and gestured to him that if he didn't get him out, "I'd kill you." Hollow grinned and twirled his blaster in his hands and pulled the trigger, and a shot was heard. Greg immediately grabbed his leg and started screaming, "Ah, bastard!" As soon as the head of the Rogues opened his mouth, the walls of the cave distorted. Several ghostly people with a distinct light yellow skin tone burst out of them. Such were not afraid of obstacles. The ghosts swam up to Greg and enveloped his body. Immediately thereafter, a demonic voice was heard. "When he sleeps, everywhere is safe, but be afraid if he wakes up." "A spider?" shouted Greg. "Incorrect!" In a blink of an eye, the ghosts tore the captain of the Milky Rogues apart. Pablo opened his mouth, but Bo put his palm to his lips in time. Torin mechanically, on reflex, drew his blasters and pointed them at the ghosts. Hollow stared at them intently and watched emotionlessly as Greg was torn apart. Immediately thereafter, Hollow took a step forward, but Ripley caught his hand and looked questioningly. Hollow carefully removed the girl's hand and walked forward. The ghosts left Greg alone and rushed at Hollow. Wrapping their arms and legs around him, they lifted the space punk's captain's body into the air. "When he sleeps, everywhere is safe. Be afraid if he wakes up." "Volcano," Hollow answered calmly. Kirby rushed forward to save the captain. Torin took aim at his opponents, and Pablo pulled out a pair of drones. "Correct." Hollow collapsed to the ground and the ghosts went back into the walls. The head of the space punks burst into laughter. Ripley, who came running in, slapped him in the face. "Idiot, idiot, don't you ever do that again." "That was cool," shouted Torin, and Dr. Smitty dropped to his knees in relief. He knew he couldn't make it in time to save Captain. "Ripley," Hollow's laugh turned to a tone of stiff command. The girl stood up and stepped aside with a snort. A passageway appeared in the far corner. It had just opened. Hollow glanced toward the passageway and rose to his feet in one motion. The team hurried into the passageway. It led them into a wide, gloomy room. In the middle of the room was an altar with a crown on it. Directly in front of the altar stood a man in a long robe. All around lay the bodies of dead girls who had clearly been sacrificed. Their blood spilled to the ground and spread in a bizarre pattern around the altar. "What do you want?" The man in the robe turned sharply around. He looked calm and unperturbed. "We've come to take the Ethereum crown from you," Hollow answered bluntly. "And why do you want it?" the man asked. "We want it back," Torin joked. "Ah, I see now. You are the one who uncovered the crown for me. The man laughed in his deep, deep voice. Stealing stolen goods. That's really in the spirit of humans. No shit, I'm albino, Bo said indignantly. I'm not human at all, winked Torin. I'm not human anymore, Kirby exclaimed firmly. I'll refrain, smiled Dr. Smitty. Hollow, Ripley, and Pablo were silent. So you're the only bastards of the human race here, huh? This is Ripley, and this is Pablo. These bastards want the crown. Hollow stepped forward. Mr. Hollow, the customer began, but Hollow interrupted him. Captain Hollow. Well, Captain Hollow, you don't understand what you're asking for. But never mind. I'll tell you what I'll do. I can pay you double what you were offered. You will give us 2 clubs? Kirby asked in amazement. Quiet, Kirby, hissed Ripley. I can offer you something of value, too. Hollow took another step forward. More valuable than an army? The customer smiled. Yes, and what is that? Your life, he said, a cold metal in his voice. No, Mr. Hollow. Captain, never mind. That's where you're wrong. The last thing I value is my life. The customer made a circular motion with his hand, and a dark, round blade appeared in the air. It spun and flew toward the head of the space punks. Hollow, lightning quickly, pulled a smoke bomb from his pocket and tossed it under his feet, shouting, Swap! The passageway filled with smoke, and the blade disappeared into the curtain. Immediately afterwards, Bo and Kirby ran out from the right and left sides of the smokescreen at the same time. Torin simply stepped forward and began firing. A drone flew out of the smoke over his head at the customer, but it flew a meter away and crashed against the wall. The adversary grinned. His right hand was pointed forward and magically blocked all of the shooter's bullets. With his left hand, he made an upward motion and sliced Thorin in half. Running down the rocky wall, Bo drew his nano-daggers and hurled them at his opponent. He put his right hand forward again and put up a magical barrier. With his left hand, he pointed at the albino and summoned a huge bear shadow right in front of him. The monster caught Bo and tore him apart. Meanwhile, Kirby managed to run to the customer, but his opponent simply stopped him a meter away. Extending his arm forward, he squeezed it. Kirby's body was engulfed in a black liquid that seeped into his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. The boy literally choked in the mysterious, viscous liquid. The smokescreen fell, and the customer looked around carefully. The dead bodies were gone. In the passage lay only a holographic projector. From behind him he heard, "Hey, jerk!" The man immediately turned around and saw the entire Space Punks team in good health behind the altar where the drone had crashed. Pablo was holding the projector remote. "How?" burst out from the customer, but at the same moment he was shot in the forehead. Blowing on his blaster, Torin laughed. Why do they always fall for that swap trick? Take the crown and go, Hollow ordered. Whilst fixing the collar of his coat, he headed for the exit. But then the unexpected happened. As soon as Bo touched the crown, the entrance to the room was blocked. Ghosts began to appear from the wall. Dozens of ghosts slowly surrounded the Space Punks.